What's up, folks, and welcome back to Dyce Reacts, where we are staying in London, England tonight. Oh yeah, we are going to be checking out 7 ways UK versus US radio is surprisingly different. Very much side checks one out. We ain't going to waste no more time. Just going to get right into it, folks. We're going to get right into it. Oh yeah.
Ever wondered about the difference between radio in the US and UK? If you have, you're in the right place, and if you haven't, stay tuned and maybe you'll learn something new anyway. Let's go back to the beginning of radio because the origin stories in both countries are pretty different and they're crucial to understanding what came after. In Britain, radio broadcasting began officially on November 14th, 1922, when station 2LO in London started transmitting from Marconi House. And this was very planned. The British Post Office, which controlled all telecommunications, decided that radio was too important to leave to random enthusiasts. So they created the British Broadcasting Company, later corporation, funded by license fees, and gave it a monopoly. The man they put in charge was named John, a 6'6" Scottish engineer who approached radio with the intensity of a Presbyterian minister who discovered the ultimate pulpit. His philosophy was crystallized in 3 words: inform, educate, entertain. Deliberately in that order. His idea was that radio should make people better, whether they wanted to be better or not. Meanwhile, in America, it was a little bit of chaos. Radio was evolving like some beautiful accident that nobody could control. The first commercial radio station, KDKA in Pittsburgh, started broadcasting on November 2nd, 1920, 2 years before Britain, by announcing the Harding-Cox presidential election results. But unlike Britain's orderly approach, American radio exploded into existence like a very disorganized Big Bang. By 1922, America had over 500 radio stations. By 1925, that number had jumped to over 1,400. And these weren't carefully planned public services. They were owned by department stores, newspapers, churches, colleges, and basically anyone who could afford a transmitter and had something to say. And so here's where the fundamental difference really shows up in how each country decided to control this new medium. Britain's approach was simple. One organization funded by the public, serving the public interest as defined by experts. The BBC's Royal Charter, granted in 1927, gave it not just permission, but a mission to be the nation's broadcaster. They would decide what was worth broadcasting, and the British public would pay for it through license fees, whether they listened or not. The American approach was like if you gave a room full of capitalists a new toy and told them to figure it out. The Radio Act of 1927 created the Federal Radio Commission, later the FCC, but its job wasn't to run radio. It was to referee the chaos. American radio would be privately owned, advertising funded, and market driven. This created a fascinating paradox. Britain, the birthplace of free market capitalism, chose state-controlled radio. And America, despite...
So this is very interesting because you think about it from being privately owned. That's how I think about it all the time.
The free market capitalism chose state-controlled radio. And America, despite its frontier mentality, ended up with more government regulation because private companies kept interfering with each other's signals. And so, like I said, BBC radio in the 1920s and 1930s was educational. Kind of aggressively so. A typical evening might include a talk on the economic development of medieval Europe, followed by a classical music concert, then perhaps a radio play adapted from Shakespeare. The BBC genuinely believed that if you exposed people to high culture long enough, they develop a taste for it. Children's programming was particularly revealing. Children's Hour, which ran from 1922 to 1964, featured stories, educational talks, and classical music. The presenters were called uncles and aunties, literally positioning the BBC as a wise family member teaching children proper culture. American radio, not so much. By 1930, American programming was dominated by variety shows, soap operas, and comedy programs sponsored by commercial products. Things were named after grocery store chains and ginger ale brands. the content wasn't secondary to the advertising. It was designed around the advertising. Now, in Britain, early BBC announcers were actually anonymous. They weren't allowed to give their names on air because the BBC felt that that would make the programming about the announcer rather than the content. The voice was meant to be authoritative and invisible, a transparent conduit for information and culture. American radio went in the exact opposite direction, as is often the case when we do these comparisons. By the 1930s, American DJs were becoming celebrities in their own right. Arthur Godfrey became so popular that his morning show could literally affect the stock market. If he endorsed a product, sales would spike immediately. His folksy conversational style made listeners feel like they were just chatting with a friend over coffee. But the real personality explosion came with top 40 radio in the 1950s. Todd Stortz, a radio station owner in Omaha, noticed that people played the same songs repeatedly on jukeboxes. So he created a format where radio stations would play the same 40 songs in rotation, but with high-energy DJs who turned each song into an event. Alan Freed, broadcasting from Cleveland and later New York, didn't just play rock and roll. He evangelized it. His shows were part concert, part revival meeting, part controlled chaos. He would scream, howl, bang on cowbells, and generally sound like he was having the best time humanly possible. Meanwhile, British DJs remained largely anonymous and restrained until about the 1960s. Now let's talk about advertising approaches, because the difference in radio advertising does again reveal something fundamental about how each culture approached the radio. British commercial radio, when it finally arrived with ITV in 1955 and
I ain't gonna lie, this is the comparison I never thought I would be so interested in. I mean, seeing the title, definitely I was just thinking about it from a music perspective, but I didn't know she was going to go in a historical context, but see from how it is done from a business perspective as well. I'm getting something that I didn't know I was going to get in this video, which is pleasant surprise, and I love pleasant surprises, man.
Commercial radio, when it finally arrived with ITV in 1955 and independent local radio in 1972, was regulated within an inch of its life. Commercials could only run during designated breaks, had very strict time limits, and couldn't make claims that couldn't be substantiated. The result was advertising that was often more thoughtful and creative than its American counterpart. Think of the subtle humor of British TV ads that became cultural touchstones. It was similar in radio. American radio advertising, on the other hand, was pure psychological warfare from the very beginning. By the 1940s, American advertisers had discovered jingles, and I mean discovered them like a scientist discovering a new element. These jingles were not just catchy, they were scientifically designed to lodge themselves in your brain and never leave. And as I talked about in another video, the soap opera radio format was literally invented to sell soap. Procter & Gamble sponsored daytime dramas because they figured housewives doing chores would be a captive audience for cleaning product advertisements. These shows ran for decades, creating emotional investment in character.
Who would have thought? Soap opera to sell soap. This is interesting, man.
American radio also pioneered product placement in ways that seem almost quaint today. The Lucky Strike hit parade didn't just play popular songs, it turned the act of ranking music into a cigarette advertisement. The host would literally say things like, "Tonight's number 3 song, brought to you by Lucky Strike, the cigarette that's toasted." Now, by the 1960s, back in the UK, the BBC's monopoly had created what was kind of a cultural problem. British teenagers were desperate for rock and roll, but BBC Radio was still largely playing orchestral music and educational programming. The generation that had grown up with Elvis and the Beatles was being served a steady diet of classical music and farming reports. Enter the Radio Pirates. Radio Caroline launched on March 28, 1964, broadcast from a ship anchored 3 miles off the British coast in international waters. The ship was called the MV Caroline, and it was equipped with a 50,000 watt transmitter that could reach most of England. For the first time, British teenagers could hear pop music on the radio whenever they wanted it. But Radio Caroline was just the beginning. Soon there was Radio London, broadcasting from the MV Galaxy, Radio City on a former World War II sea fort, Radio Scotland, and dozens of others. These stations weren't just playing different music, they were introducing American-style DJ personalities to British radio. The DJs on these pirate stations became genuine celebrities. Tony Blackburn, who later became a BBC Radio 1 legend, got his start on Radio Caroline. Emperor Roscoe brought American-style rapid-fire DJ talk to British audiences. These weren't anonymous BBC voices anymore. These were personalities with catchphrases, sound effects, and genuine enthusiasm for the music they were playing. The British government's response was very bureaucratic. They passed the Marine Broadcasting Offences Act in 1967, making it illegal to supply the pirate stations with fuel, food, or advertising revenue. Rather than raid the ships with the Royal Navy, which would have been dramatic, they simply starved them out through paperwork. But here's the fascinating part. The pirates had already won. The BBC, faced with obvious popularity of pop music radio, launched BBC Radio 1 in September of 1967, specifically to play popular music. They even hired many of the former pirate DJs to staff it. Now, while Britain was dealing with literal pirates, America was going through its own radio revolution. The rise of FM. Edwin Armstrong had invented FM, frequency modulation radio, in the 1930s, and it was technically superior to AM in every way. It had better sound quality, no static, and stereo capability. But commercial interests kept it marginalized for decades because AM radio was profitable and FM threatened that popularity. By the 1960s, however, FM was finally taking off and it was becoming something completely different from AM radio. While AM
Yes, I can remember when I was very young, AM was very popular. And I'm just realizing when FM came, FM, it was FM, many of the times when I came across a station and I could have hardly get an AM station, it was like almost like dead. But being that young, you don't even know what's going on in the world in terms of, especially from a technological point of view, when everything is just being brought into fold, very new. So I was more just concerned about the music, not as to what's going on in terms of the technological space. As she's saying that, I realized that phase was going on because there was a time when I was young, like I said, I got so many AM stations trying to look for stations, but the FM was almost like non-existent. But as she made that statement there, it just rang a bell.
While AM remained the domain of top 40 hits and talk radio, FM became the home of album-oriented rock, progressive DJs, and longer, more experimental programming. WNEW-FM in New York, which was launched in 1967, epitomized this brand new approach. DJs like Scott Muni and Roscoe, the same Emperor Roscoe who had worked on British pirate radio, would play entire album sides. They would also take requests, and they would generally treat radio like a conversation with friends rather than that carefully constructed commercial service. The contrast with British radio was stark. American FM DJs in the 1970s had enormous freedom to play whatever they wanted, often for hours at a time. A DJ might play a 20-minute Pink Floyd track, followed by a 3-minute punk song, followed by a jazz instrumental, whatever felt right in that moment. This was the era of legendary American radio personalities. Britain adopted a systematic approach to radio frequencies that was very precise. The BBC was allocated specific frequencies and it used them efficiently. When they introduced VHF FM radio in 1955, it was carefully planned to provide optimal coverage with minimal interference. America's frequency allocation was messier. The AM band was packed with stations, leading to interference problems that persist to this day. Some American AM stations had to reduce power at sunset to avoid interfering with distant stations, creating a complex web of broadcasting restrictions that required detailed engineering calculations because it was just too messy. And the difference in FM adoption is pretty revealing. Britain introduced BBC Radio 3 on FM in 1946, but it was still largely used for classical music and educational programming, high-quality content for high-quality transmission. America didn't really embrace FM until the 1960s, but when it did, like we said, FM became the playground for experimental programming. By the 1970s, American FM stations were broadcasting in stereo with high fidelity, while many British stations were still mono. But British stations had better coverage areas and more reliable signals due to superior planning and coordination. Now let's talk about the DJ culture expansion of the 1970s and 1980s, because in America, the rise of disco in the 1970s created a new kind of DJ. He didn't just play records, but he mixed them together into continuous dance sets. New York DJs like Larry Levan at the Paradise Garage and David Mancuso at the Loft weren't radio DJs. They were club DJs who influenced how music was made and consumed, and this culture fed back into radio. American radio DJs began incorporating mixing techniques, sound effects, and production elements that turned radio shows into more like audio collages. The Morning Zoo format, pioneered by stations like Z100 in New York, featured teams of DJs doing comedy sketches, prank phone calls, and elaborate production pieces between songs. Now, British radio DJ culture evolved differently. John Peel, who began broadcasting on Radio 1 in 1967, he became a cultural institution by sharing new and experimental music. His show was the opposite of American Top 40 radio. He might play a Moroccan folk song, followed by a death metal track, followed by a teenage band's demo recording. Peel's influence on British music culture was immeasurable. Getting a Peel session, which is a live recording session for his show, was often more valuable to new brands than getting a record deal. And so then the contrast between the countries switched again because American radio was becoming more formatted and commercial, while British radio was making space for more genuine musical exploration. By the 1980s, American radio advertising had become an even more sophisticated operation. Stations employed teams of writers and producers to create advertising that was genuinely entertaining, like a crazy radio commercial. Consider the work of Stan Freberg, who created radio commercials that were more like audio theater pieces. He had a 1957 commercial for a tomato paste brand that featured a full orchestra, a complex narrative about the Roman Empire, and production values that rivaled radio dramas. It was advertising, but it was also genuinely entertainment. American radio also pioneered what's called drive time, the recognition that people listen to radio differently during commuting hours. Morning shows became elaborate entertainment productions designed to keep people listening in.
You can see as the time progressed, both sides put a lot of strategy into their programming, and it's just nice to hear the historical nature of how radio developed, because you may just think that it was just always just normal from the way it is today in terms of the shows and the way that they go about doing music, but it all has to start from somewhere. And then as time progressed, it develops a gradual progression. But you don't think of that because you just think that someone in the studio, in a booth somewhere, playing songs randomly with no thought whatsoever. But even if some people may actually do that, but I'm just talking about the way that the module is of radio, how it began. You think that it just started that way, but it's just like any other thing. It had stages of progression, and that's very interesting. I never thought I would be getting some historical detail like that in this video. So, yeah, I thought it was going to be a little different. So yeah, and I'm enjoying it.
This brings up names like Howard Stern, who began his national syndication in 1986, turning morning radio into appointment listening. British radio advertising, when it existed, remained more restrained. The Independent Broadcasting Authority, later known as Ofcom, maintained strict standards for advertising content and its placement. British radio ads were often more subtle and clever than their American counterparts. And then we have the digital revolution. The arrival of digital technology in the 1990s and 2000s affected British and American radio in different ways. Digital audio broadcasting was adopted much more successfully in Britain than in America. The BBC embraced digital radio early, launching new digital-only stations like BBC Radio 6 Music and BBC Radio 4 Extra. The public service model made it easier to invest in new technology without worrying about immediate commercial returns. America's adoption of HD radio, which is the American digital radio standard, was much slower and less successful. Commercial radio stations were reluctant to invest in new technology technology that might not provide immediate returns, and listeners were generally already satisfied with existing FM quality. But the real digital revolution came from outside traditional radio entirely. Podcasting, internet radio, and music streaming services challenged both British and American radio in ways that revealed the strengths and weaknesses in each system. American commercial radio's tight formatting and heavy advertising made it vulnerable to ad-free alternatives like Spotify and Apple Music. Finally, listeners could get music without commercials and talk without interruption. Many American radio stations lost significant audiences to these alternatives. British radio, with its public service tradition and more diverse programming, proved more resilient. BBC Radio maintained its audience partly because it offered content like news, comedy, and dramas that couldn't be easily replicated by music streaming services.
Man, she just made me go back in time of the radio era, man. And how much it was such an amazing time growing up. Radio was such a gem for especially music lovers, man. When you have an artist that you love, or some type of music that you love, especially when you have seen it on television, and you go listen to the radio, hoping that the song is played, and you got your cassette, and you waiting to record the song, and you're just hoping the announcer doesn't talk in the middle of the song or put an ad in like halfway in the song, or he doesn't play the entire song. You're hoping because you want to get the song. I remember those times, man. Sometimes you get pissed off as the listener because some announcers just talk too much, and you're just hoping to get just that song that you want so much. And sometimes you get it, sometimes you don't get it. And even there are times you don't know the artist. You hear a song playing and you're late coming in the living room or wherever the radio is, and the announcer still didn't say it at the end of the song. He just went into the next song or went into an advertisement or some other programming, and you're like, man, how are you gonna find the song? But right now we have so many things in terms of helping you find music, like Shazam. I'm not being paid for that. I'm just saying, like you said, the digital era came in streaming and all those things. You could get music and you don't have to listen to ads. So for listeners this time, which is still now, I never thought I was going to get an historical context to the radio, the versus British radio versus American radio. I thought it was going to go in another direction. I don't know quite how she was going to do it, but certainly not that direction at all, because this was a very deep dive historically, which I was not expecting. Shout out to her, she did a damn good job, and it was very fun and engaging. If you want to see that long journey, should I do, hit me up on Dyce Reacts, we have the music reactions. This is where I'm going to be making my exit. So until next time, peace out.